Hey, what's up, folks? Welcome to another way too early preview of the Texas football schedule. This week, we're doing the Florida Gators. We'll break them down, offense, defense, and special teams as well, and take a look ahead here. My man CJ Vogel, lifetime Longhorn CJ Vogel, joining me as well to break it down. I'm lifetime Longhorn Rod Babers. Thank you guys for joining us. CJ, the Florida Gators, there is talent there. I was actually looking at Bud Elliott's blue chip ratio, and essentially, to simplify it, it's teams in college football who have at least 50% of their roster that actually are blue chips, 4- and 5-star recruits. You know, a lot of people are low on Florida this year, or they're down on Florida, I should say. But they actually meet the blue chip ratio. Talking about 58% of that roster is considered blue chip. So there's talent on the Florida roster. There's no doubt about that. But they have had 3 losing seasons in a row, and Billy Napier is on the hot seat. There's no question about that. And they have arguably the hardest schedule in the country. So there's a lot of people predicting that Billy Napier might not even be the head coach by the time they end up playing Texas. We shall see. But we'll dive into it. But what are your thoughts initially about the Florida program, Billy Napier, and what kind of track they're on?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Rob. Whenever you say it's going to be a tough sledding for the Florida Gators in 2024, right? That schedule is as tough as the schedule I've ever seen ahead of or going into a season. I mean, it's ridiculous to start out with what they have to play. Basically, coming to Texas, we'll see what that team looks like. Later on in the season, obviously, it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster, I would say, right now. But to your point, they do have talent, right? That's the last 4 recruiting classes for the Florida Gators, 12, 13, 13, and 18. So
yeah,
they've been stockpiling a little bit. They've been in that conversation, obviously, of Florida, the state in itself being the flagship there and, having to battle Florida State, right? You do get a lot of talented football players, even if those ratings don't surprise you or kind of, put fear in, what an opposing team might feel like. But Florida's going to have talent, and they absolutely will be. The question is, what will that mentality be if you walk into DKR later in the season and you have 4 losses on your resume already? Do you still get up for a road game, in which you're expected to compete and, hang close with the Texas Longhorns? I wonder that right now, way too early, Rod. I feel like Texas has the upper edge, playing at home, having much more to play for in my eyes as well. But Florida is not a team that you can take lightly, that's for sure.
Yep, totally agree with you on that. And let's start with offense. They do actually have, I think, some weapons on offense, and they have some impact players starting at the quarterback position. Graham Mertz coming back after leading the SEC in completion percentage last year, almost 73%. He was second in touchdown to interception ratio, 20 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. So he takes care of the football, 6th in yards per attempt in the SEC. But they actually didn't throw the football downfield a lot. That's one that they got the ball out of his hands really quickly, and they didn't throw it vertically downfield that often. And I think that's what kind of kept those turnover-worthy plays down. He is a little bit more than a game manager, but he's not necessarily a guy that's going to go out there and put the cape on for you and go win a game. But he is better than a game manager. I will say that. I was actually pleasantly surprised doing some research on Graham Mertz. He's going to be one of the better quarterbacks that Texas will play this upcoming season.
Yeah, he will be. And, it's kind of interesting, for folks that watched him in the Big Ten, you probably sat back just as I did and said, oh, yeah, let him go to Florida. Let's see what he can do. That's not going to put any fear in anybody. He was actually a pretty solid quarterback a year ago, right? You just laid out the numbers. The thing with Graham Mertz and the thing with Florida is the lack of a vertical passing threat and kind of that lack of vertical passing in their offense in its entirety does not allow that offense to have many explosive plays. And again, with Graham Mertz, takes care of the football very well. A 1.4% turnover-worthy passing attempts, that's 3rd best in all of college football a year ago. He does a very good job of taking care of the rock. He also does a very good job of getting the ball in the hands of his receivers, right? He had about a 72% passing completion rate a year ago. The issue, again, they don't throw the ball down the field. He had the lowest average distance of target in all of the SEC a year ago, under 7 yards downfield. That's not great, right? Especially when you're going to be playing teams like Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, Oklahoma, teams that like to throw and get the ball down the field with explosive plays through the air. Florida doesn't do it. Luckily, they do have a really talented wide receiver. That's Eugene Wilson, that I believe is going to be their number one. They got Elijah Badger over from Arizona State. So they have weapons again. That's going to be the recurring theme whenever we talk about Florida. The issue is, will they be able to get the rock to them in a sufficient manner? And will they be able to extend those kind of 3, 4, 5-yard quick throws into gains of 15, 20 and chunk plays beyond that? That's the big question right now.
Yes, it's actually kind of going back to kind of some fundamentals when you play Florida. You want to make sure your open field tackling is on point. Because you're right. A guy like Eugene Wilson, it's amazing because I saw that, he has the lowest. You go look at his average depth of target. It's one of the lowest in college football as a wide receiver. So there were a lot of long handoffs basically to him as a player. But he had 0 drops and also ended up having 18 forced missed tackles. So he's a running back when he gets the ball in his hands. A lot of people have compared him to Percy Harvin actually down there in Florida. Yeah, exactly. That's a scary thought. Even if you just say low budget Percy Harvin, that's still a scary thought. So he's a really good player for him. And you're right about Elijah Badger. I went back and looked at the last 2 years for you go look at it for Badger at Arizona State coming in as a transfer. I think the guy had over 1,600, over 1,500 yards and 135 receptions. 10 touchdowns, extremely productive at Arizona State. So they're bringing in some guys who, via the transfer portal that are some proven commodities. They're actually going to bring in another wide receiver from from Wisconsin. I hope I get his name right. Shemiri Dike, wide receiver from Wisconsin, transfer. This is a guy that had 66 receptions, over 1,000 yards in his 2 seasons there at Wisconsin. So he's got some familiarity there with Graham Mertz from his time in Wisconsin. So they actually do have some weapons in the passing game. I'm with you, though. You don't really have to worry about them threatening you vertical. You don't have to defend every blade of grass with the Florida passing game. That's the beauty of it. Yeah. You don't have to defend every blade of grass, right? So it makes your job a lot easier. You just got to make sure you're on point with open field tackling.
It'll be interesting, Rod, to see how aggressive Texas is defensively, right? We talked about it a little bit leading up to the Alabama game a year ago. You felt like you could get ahead of a Jalen Milroe, the one-step drop back, hit his back foot, and he's going to fire that ball to his first read. Obviously, you have the threat of the deep ball, and Texas got beat a couple times with the deep ball. I think with Graham Mertz, you're going to have that same ability to undercut, to be aggressive, to jump routes without having that fear of a double move or the go route, right? Those posts, those corners, those vertical threats. I look back at Eugene Wilson's, again, I'm going back to the average distance of target here, Rod, 2.8 yards down the field. So it tells you right away what they like to do. They like to get the ball out quickly, whether it be through screens, some of those jailbreaks, underneath crossers, slants, anything short. That's great. I think Texas absolutely will sit there and say, take your 2-3 yards. We'll rally. We'll get 10, 11 hats to the ball, and we'll make the tackle there. You're not going to beat us in those underneath routes. That kind of that bend but don't break defense, I think, is what Texas will deploy whenever Florida comes to town. But, hey, that running game is what you're going to have to stop, right? That I think that's the area in which I think Texas is going to have to look at and say, all right, let's make Graham Mertz beat us. Montrell Johnson, very talented running back. He was a first-team All-SEC preseason honoree. That offensive line, pretty talented as well. So we'll see what that brings whenever they come to DKR. But at the same time, if Texas is able to get an early lead, Rod, I'm not sure that Florida will have the firepower through the air to sustain a close game there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point there, and that stat you gave about Eugene Wilson is mind blowing. I mean, they're just long handoffs when you watch it. It makes perfect sense. They're just long, but he does a great job of making something out of nothing. But one other quick stat too about the passing game, because you're right, the running game is really going to be, I think, the primary lifeblood, the engine of this offense, because Graham Mertz, they don't want to put him in, precarious and compromising situations. So getting back to it though, he really got hot, or at least he found his groove toward the end of the season. And if he takes a leap then with these weapons that we just mentioned, then you could be talking about, Florida cooking a little bit on offense. Maybe they do take some more chances. Maybe they do add some verticality to the offense. But listen, this stat here kind of threw me off, and it shows you the maturity of Graham Mertz. Since October of last season, basically look at from October on of last year, he had 69% completion percentage, 14 touchdowns, only 1 interception. Really started to find his groove toward the end of the season. That's against SEC opponents now too.
Yeah.
Started to find his groove against. He wasn't making those vertical shots downfield. He wasn't making those kind of throws, but he was taking really good care of the football, and he was operating at a certain level of efficiency. And now you're going to add, but he had Ricky Pearsall. I will say they did lose a first-round wide receiver, and he did lose Trevor Etienne on offense as well, who was their most explosive running back. So they lost their most explosive wide receiver and their most, I won't say the most, they lost the most productive wide receiver and their most explosive running back. So they got to try to find a way to add that explosivity in the running game, because Montrell Johnson Jr., he's good. He's solid. He's consistent. I don't know if I would describe him as explosive.
Again, kind of the recurring theme with Florida. They're going to have good weapons. They're going to play good football, but it's the explosivity that remains lacking. Rod, it's interesting. Graham Mertz finishes the year strong in 2023. Florida ended the year on a 5-game losing streak, right? You look back, they start 5-2. They have a big win over Tennessee. They go to South Carolina. That's not an easy place to play. They win by 2 points, 41-39. They take a week off, and then they play Georgia. Arkansas, they lose in overtime. LSU, you allow 50. Missouri, lose on the road. You play Florida State, you put up an absolute dud with only 15 points offensively. That wraps up your season at 5-7. And now you're looking again at Billy Napier and the job that he has, not just in 2023, because it was a tough conclusion in that second half to the season, but also looking ahead to 2024. And again, you're sitting in there thinking, man, we got to play UCF to open. We got to play Florida State and Miami again this year in non-conference. Holy cow. Plus an entire SEC slate.
Yeah.
Good luck. Good luck. We'll see what kind of momentum Graham Mertz starts the year with, Rod. But it's it's not going to be easy, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's crazy. He was playing his best football, and yet the team, they obviously, for some reason, it didn't translate to wins for the team. But I think that kind of shows you what we're talking about with Graham Mertz. He's a little bit more than the game manager, but in terms of his overall impact on the game as a player, it leaves a lot to be desired. And that's why the running game is really, really important for them. So Montrell Johnson Jr., they also have Trayan Webb, I believe it's his name. He was a third leading rusher from last year. They got him. He returns. But really, it's about that offensive line. And they actually last year had one of the better offensive lines run blocking wise. It was actually a pretty decent offensive line. But they did allow 22 more sacks than they did in 2022. And they rushed for, I believe it was 1.24 fewer yards per carry than they did compared to 2022. So there was regression on the offensive with the offensive line. They are going to bring in some transfers. San Diego State transfer tackle Brandon Crenshaw. They're bringing him in. They do return one of their other tackles, left tackle Austin Barber on the offensive line. They have one of the better centers in college football in Jake Slaughter. He returns along with two other starters on that offensive line, and he's one of the nation's best centers. Actually, Pro Football Focus had him as the second highest graded center. So the O-line, if those three returning starters and the transfers coming in, if they can gel pretty quickly with the weapons we talked about, Graham Mertz takes a leap, then I think you're cooking on offense if you're Florida. That's a lot of things, a lot of ifs, things got to come together. But it is possible that this offense could end up kind of taking a huge leap in improvement all around. And then you could have maybe not an explosive offense, but you could definitely have one that's effective and controlling the ball, because you really want to help that defense, which we'll get to. You don't want to leave that defense exposed, because last year, that's what happened all too much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to come down to whether or not you can put the points on the board offensively and whether or not you'll be able to sustain that close game. Again, as I mentioned, just being able to hang around with explosive offenses that you face. Again, I question a little bit what Florida has defensively as well. That wasn't a strength last year, especially when you look at the run game. But offensively, it just doesn't strike me as an offense that Texas will and have a whole lot of issues with right now. We'll see what those transfer wide receivers can do to their offense. But, when you start looking at the other side of the ball, Rod, I'm thinking Texas will have success running the football. I do, and that was a big issue last year for Florida. I'm looking at the numbers now. They allowed 29.5 points per game. That was 85th. Yards per game, 406 yards per game allowed. That was 91st. Rush yards per game or per attempt allowed, 5.1 yards per attempt allowed via the ground. That was 117th. So if you're Florida and you're used to and kind of, familiar with the history of the trenches at the University of Florida, that's unacceptable. You cannot allow plus, over 5 yards per carry outside of the top 115 programs in the country in terms of yards per attempt. That's really poor. If you're able to, if Florida has anything close to that again, it's going to be a very long year, and I don't think Napier makes it through the season. That's where I think Texas makes their hay whenever Florida comes to town, is on that ground game, behind that offensive line, letting those big bodies push around Florida a little bit and sustain the clock like we've seen them do at times. That's where I think Texas comes away with the victory there.
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, the defense was desperate last year. They couldn't find a way to solve their issues in the run game. And because of their issues, Billy Napier fired the defensive line coach, and he fired the secondary coach and hired DC Ron Roberts to take over the defense. So they will look different because they have a new coordinator and play caller. But I even looked at the defensive line. Man, behind Georgia, they probably behind Georgia and Bama, they have as many 300-pound D linemen as any team in the SEC. They got 9 of them. I think Texas has 8 on this roster, just to give you perspective. So they got beef, literally on the offensive line. They got on the D line. They got mass, but they're lacking now just playmakers on that defensive line. They lost Princely Umanmielen. Guy had 7 sacks last year on the edge for him. They lost him. They did bring in a couple of reinforcements on the defensive front. Joey Slackman from Penn is the guy they brought in there. They also brought in some reinforcements via the secondary. A couple of guys in the secondary they brought in. Asa Turner out of Washington, 6th-year safety. They brought him in, try to shore up the secondary. Cormani McClain, I'm not even sure what's happening with that. Is he with Florida? I know there was some talk about him coming from Colorado, and I don't know. So that's another transfer. They reportedly brought in Cormani McClain. Not sure about that. They have a really good young safety though. Jordan Castell last year was a freshman, but one of the better young freshman safeties in the country. Had 5 forced incompletions and an interception. He's one of the best safeties in the SEC. So he's a really good player for them. The linebackers, Shamar James is a really good player, I think, for them, but he had an injury last year, so only played, I think, in 8 games. Justice Boone, another linebacker for them. Those guys are expected to kind of solidify the middle. They did get a South Carolina transfer at linebacker, Grayson Howard, I believe is his name. But, the secondary should have some veteran pieces. Devin Moore's a 3rd-year cornerback that he's going to return for them. He was hurt last year. There's a starter, 4th-year cornerback, John Marshall Jr. He's a returning starter. So they have some pieces in the secondary where they're lacking, as you pointed out, is going to be in the defensive front on the defensive line. They just don't have enough playmakers, and they lost one in Princely Umanmielen.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting one, right? I look at Princely Umanmielen as a guy, again, out of the Manor area. Texas is familiar with him. One-time Texas commit before flipping over late to Florida in that cycle. That was the one guy who was you could point to and say, yeah, okay, wherever Princely's at, make sure we got a body there, make sure we got a tight end chipping. He's gone now. Where do you get your pressure? We've talked about on the Texas side of things, who's going to be the guy that you could point to and say, all right, we know that they're going to go put pressure on the quarterback and get a sack. Well, last year was probably from the interior, right? Ethan Burke, Barron Sorrell, Anthony Hill at times, they all kind of had their moments, but the consistency maybe wasn't where you wanted that to be. A year ago, Princely Umanmielen, 8 sacks. You could point to he's a bona fide number 1 guy off the edge. He's gone now. Who takes that next leap for the Florida Gators? Otherwise, again, for Texas to have an experienced offensive line, where do you see Florida getting pressure on Quinn Ewers if it's not a guy like Princely? I think right now it's going to be a big question mark for them. Again, they'll have plenty of opportunities prior to the Texas game to kind of find out who those pieces are. But again, I just question if they have the horses to make those explosive plays defensively. It's kind of that recurring theme. Good athletes, good football players, explosivity on both sides of the ball a bit lacking.
Yeah, just playmakers in general, and for Florida, that's crazy because usually that is not the case. Yeah, because they definitely got a lot of talent. On the special teams, actually, they do have some pretty consistent, dependable playmakers. Jeremy Crenshaw is the one of the top punters. He's their punter there. He had a 48.9 yard average on 42 punts last year. That was pretty good for Crawshaw. Also, Trey Smack, who took over their kicking duties around week 3. He converted 17 of 21 field goal attempts, which was pretty good in terms of consistency for a kicker. And Eugene Wilson, we talked about him, right? Basically, their version of Percy Harvin. He has a lot of the return duties for Florida, and he's a really good return guy. He's just great in the open field with the ball in his hands, period. He's dangerous. Probably their most dangerous, lethal weapon, if you will, overall on the team. That's somebody Texas will have to account for, even on special teams as well. But special teams should be a consistent phase for them. Defense, I'm not so sure. I think offense, actually, there's some potential for Florida offensively, that with a veteran quarterback and with some of the pieces that we talked about, those weapons. But I do think for Texas, considering high powered the Texas offense is this year and how improved the defense is supposed to be this year, I think Texas will make quick work of the Florida Gators. Pretty much.
I tend to agree, Rod. Again, I think what we talk about with Texas is that big play ability, to score in spurts, to allow Sarkisian to get into a rhythm. We've seen them at times go 3 or 4 straight possessions finding the end zone. If that's the case at any point against Florida, I don't know if they have the firepower right now to, again, just kind of body that, to take that blow on the chin and be able to get back up for the next quarter, the next possession, and keep that a ball game. I just don't think that they have the horses right now. Again, kind of bizarre when you're talking about Florida to not have the big-time playmakers. Again, we'll see what kind of rhythm Graham Mertz and those new wide receivers are able to do alongside Eugene Wilson. But, and again, it's the average distance of target. It's the offensive philosophy. They don't air the ball out, and they don't have a lot of big plays. That's the issue right now with Florida.
And then going back to Sark's recipe, as you talked about, when Sark has that run and he can get up 2 scores, get up double digits, he wants to choke his opponent out in the second half with the run game. I'm not sure they can stop the run when Texas goes into that phase of their winning formula. And so I think it's going to be a problem. Just a bad matchup for Florida this year. All right, good stuff there, CJ. Appreciate you as always. Next week, we'll be back, talk about the Arkansas Razorbacks. Yeah, last time the Longhorns were in Fayetteville. Didn't go well. I think it'll go a lot better this time around. We'll talk about that next time. Thank you guys for joining us. Thanks, my man CJ, for all of the knowledge for the On Texas Football family. Until next time, hook 'em horns.